Hey everybody, welcome back to the Fantasy Football X Factor podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Lamarco. Today we're diving into Week 9. So I decided to change some things up a little bit today. I'm going to try to make this podcast a lot quicker. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dive into the injuries and the key ones and how it'll impact the weekly games. And then I'm going to touch on some of the high-profile starts on the passing game side, run game side, and some streamers as well. So go right into the injury report. So right off the bat, Detroit versus Minnesota is the first game I'm going to talk about. Detroit's actually pretty healthy. Minnesota's getting back some key players this week. Xavier Rhodes and Andrew Sendejo are big returns. Obviously, the trade of Golden Tate really opens up the targets here for the Kenny Golladay and for Marvin Jones. But, the strength of the Minnesota Vikings is their outside corners with Rhodes and Trey Waynes. So the thing is, who's going to take over the slot? Is it TJ Jones or is this kid Powell who's been talked up? So it's going to be interesting to say the least. I personally would say you could take a stash on a guy like Powell because those slot targets are pretty important in this offense from Golden Tate is vacating. And Luke Wilson and Roberts, the tight ends, are really not prominent players. And one player I do want to highlight too because of the Golden Tate trade is Theo Riddick. A lot of those checkdowns now, those short passes will go to Theo Riddick. And Kerryon Johnson, to me, I'm a little concerned because last week a lot of his production came in the passing game. With Theo Riddick's return, he's not going to get as many opportunities. So against a tough run defense, I'm not as high on Kerryon this week. He's not a must-start RB2. He's more in that flex range. Next game is Baltimore and Pittsburgh. And now Baltimore has been banged up on the offensive line. Alex Lewis might be returning the guard, but they might be down both their tackles in this game against Pittsburgh, who now is getting very healthy. The Pittsburgh Steelers, they're on the rise. I mean, their off defense in the early season was getting torched, but the returns of Joe Hayden and Morgan Burnett have really solidified this defense in the back end and the secondary. So, this Baltimore team, it's going to be interesting with two tackles out of this game. It's going to be interesting how they keep Flacco upright, actually, especially after a down game against the Carolina Panthers. On the Pittsburgh side, they're going to be down Marcus Gilbert again. I think that Big Ben, for me, is not an ideal start, especially on the road against a very tough opponent in the Baltimore Ravens, down one of his tackles. Next matchup is Kansas City versus Cleveland. Quick injuries are Antonio Callaway, Joe Sherbert, and EJ Gaines. Antonio Callaway being out is kind of big. Rashard Higgins kind of flutters into that wide receiver 3. Kansas City will put up points in this game, so the loss of Antonio Callaway really opens up targets, and, David Njoku should bounce back this week. But Rashard Higgins might be someone you can, take a flyer on if you're desperate with all these bye weeks. Sherbert, of course, he's the linebacker. He's probably the best linebacker they have. His loss is going to be felt when covering Travis Kelce and Kareem Hunt. And then EJ Gaines returning just helps that secondary against this very tough opponent in the back end. On the Kansas City side, they're pretty healthy. They're out their center again, but it doesn't matter. This offense just kept rolling. On the Jets-Dolphins game, there's some big ones for the Jets. So Neil Sterling is kind of big because he was a part of this 4-man rotation at tight end. This is going to open up targets and snaps en route for Chris Herndon. And Chris Herndon's a quality streamer this week. The Dolphins have allowed 5 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks to tight ends. And Chris Herndon will actually be able to get more routes. He actually ran a season-high 17 routes last week. So I think that he opens up more opportunities with Neil Sterling out. Tremaine Johnson also out of this game. And Andre Roberts looks doubtful for the game as well. The pass catchers for Miami, for the Jets, it's tough. On the Dolphins side, it looks like Kenny Stills will be back this week. Puts a little bit of a damper on the Devontae Parker excitement after a big week, but it'll be interesting to see how the targets shake out in that one. Bears versus the Bills. Looks like Allen Robinson and Khalil Mack are going to be doubtful for this game. Allen Robinson being out hurts Taylor Gabriel because that means you'll see a lot more of Tre'Davious White, and that's not really good for his matchup. It's a really tough one for the Bears anyway on the road. The good news is that Tremaine Edmonds, the stud rookie linebacker, and Trent Murphy are both out, and they're both good in pass rush. So the pass rush for the Bills is going to be depleted in this game, and losing that coverage linebacker as well is tough. So it's going to be better news for a guy like Tariq Cohen, who I think is the best bet of the Bears position players this week. And also the Bears will be down Kyle Long. So Kyle Long is the stud guard. He'll be out. He got hurt last week, so he's out of this game, which kind of is a detriment to Jordan Howard. On the Bucks-Panthers, so the Bucks will be down MJ Stewart, Ronald Jones, and Evan Dietrich Smith. He's just a depth piece. But the one guy here is MJ Stewart. MJ Stewart's the starting slot corner who has just been getting roasted all year. And his loss, it's better to know the man. It's better the grass isn't always greener on the other side, I guess. And I think that MJ Stewart being out, I don't know who's going to be covering the slot. But it really, DJ Moore has an opportunity here to have a huge game. I think he, with the loss of MJ in the slot, 4 of his 6 targets came last week out of the slot, and Torrey Smith is out this week as well. Chargers, Seahawks, everyone's pretty healthy in this game, so there's nothing really to report. The next up is Texans, Broncos. Zach Cunningham, who's actually the starting linebacker for the Texans, is going to be out, and he's actually very good in run defense, which is an improvement for Phillip Lindsay, because Royce Freeman looks questionable at best for this matchup. And on the other side of the football, the Broncos will be out Bradley Roby, Darren Stewart, and Brandon Marshall. And Marshall's the starting linebacker. Darren Stewart is the safety, and Bradley Roby's the cornerback. And this is huge because, with how hot Deshaun Watson has been the last couple weeks, and, it's going to be interesting what Demaryius Thomas can do with that matchup. But Bradley Roby being out is a downgrade, even though he's the 90th ranked corner in football. He's not playing that well this season, but it's a big hit to them because Adam Jones hasn't been in out of the lineup as well. He's another starter. But that should open up to Hopkins should have a monster game in this game. And, it's just going to be tough to see how the targets figure out now with Kiki QT coming back this week, Ryan Griffin as well, and Demaryius Thomas now in the fold. Rams, Saints, the big one is Marcus Davenport, the stud rookie defensive end. That's going to be a matchup upgrade for the Rams. There's nothing to report on the Rams side of the football. They're pretty healthy. And the night game is the Packers and the Patriots. And Shaq Mason and Geronimo Allison are out. Allison's departure opens up targets for the rest of the guys. It puts Marquez Valdez-Scantling on the wide receiver 3 map, potentially in a really tough matchup against the Pats corners. And then Shaq Mason's actually the number 2 guard in Pro Football Focus rankings. So him being out is a big downgrade for Sony Michel, but we'll touch on a little bit that I don't even think that matters against the Packers. All right, so what I did is I kind of took the look at each game, and I kind of identified a couple key passing game matchups. So we're going to go over the passing games first, and I broke them out in tiers. There's 3 tiers. The tier 1 matchups this week is the Rams, Panthers, Chiefs, and Minnesota Vikings. Those are the 4 offenses I identified as the best matchups. And the guys that I'm really targeting in those matchups, Devin Funchess for the Carolina Panthers. He has a great matchup versus the outside corners of Tampa Bay, Brent Grimes and Charlton Davis, both ranked 67th and 91st in Pro Football Focus cover rankings apiece. DJ Moore with Torrey Smith out. I also like his matchup. Like I just touched on, 4 of his 6 targets came out of the slot last week. The Bucs will be down MJ Stewart in that, who's also allowing the most yards per coverage snap anyway. So I think it's a great matchup either way for DJ Moore. And then Greg Olsen. Tampa Bay allows the most yards per game to tight ends this season. So I think that you have to get Olsen into your lineups this week. The next one is Kansas City versus the Cleveland Browns. Obviously, you're going Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce. Those guys are big. We're not going to need to tell you that. But one guy I'm kind of fading a little bit this week, I'm not overly excited for, is Sammy Watkins. The Browns have been solid against number 2 receivers this season, and he has a negative matchup according to Pro Football Focus. So I'm not really that high on Sammy Watkins this week, even though this is a plus draw for the passing game. Minnesota Vikings versus Detroit. Obviously, you're starting Diggs and you're starting Thielen, but the one guy I do like too is Kyle Rudolph this week. The Lions are 31st in DVOA versus the tight end, so I think that's a plus draw for him. And that wraps up the Tier 1. Tier 2 is Washington Redskins, Green Bay Packers, the Los Angeles Chargers, and the Baltimore Ravens. Now, first off, Washington versus Atlanta. Atlanta's been getting beat up all year by receivers. I think the one guy I want to highlight is Paul Richardson, and I think he's a solid wide receiver 3 this week in this matchup. The reason is simple. Chris Thompson's out, Jamison Crowder's out. And also, Atlanta, surprisingly, with their injuries, is very good at stopping the tight end. And Jordan Reed, he's taking up a lot of those short routes, but I think with Alford and Trufant are the outside corners for the Atlanta Falcons. They're both playing very bad this year. They're both outside the top 75 in Pro Football Focus cornerback rankings. So I think this is a good matchup for Paul Richardson. I think he actually can take advantage of this. Next matchup, Green Bay versus New England Patriots. The one guy I want to highlight here is Jimmy Graham. Now, Jimmy Graham, to me, in this matchup, New England is built on their cornerback trio. They have stud cornerbacks inside and out, and I think that where their weakness is against the tight end. The tight end they have allowed the 7th most yards per game and also the 4th most targets to the tight end per game. So I think this is a good matchup for Jimmy Graham, especially because Geronimo Allison is going to be out. So they're going to be relying a little bit more on the rookie Marquez Valdez-Scantling against Jason McCourty. Stephon Gilmore will shadow Devontae Adams. Obviously, I think Devontae Adams is a good enough receiver to win, but it's going to open up opportunities for Jimmy Graham, and I think he's going to be the biggest beneficiary of that game. The next up is the Chargers versus Seattle, and Seattle's been a product of who they've played, and every one of the wide receivers in this matchup have a plus draw. So Mike Williams, Tyrell Williams and Keenan Allen are all on the starter radar this week. One guy I like to highlight the most here is Tyrell Williams. He's actually been outperforming Mike Williams, and I think that he is actually a very good wide receiver 3 flex player this week. But all three of these guys are on the radar, and Phillip Rivers should be a fired-up, must-start player this week in this matchup. The next up is Baltimore versus Pittsburgh. Now, Joe Hayden, I'm expecting to shadow Michael Crabtree because Crabtree only plays 12% of his snaps in the slot. Joe Hayden usually is an outside corner. They also have Mike Hilton in the slot, so they usually keep Hayden on the outsides. And I think that John Brown moves around enough because he's about 30-30 and 30 across the board for each of the positions. So he's around the field constantly. I think the one guy you want in this matchup is going to be John Brown. And the thing I will say is this, is the Pittsburgh Steelers defense is not the same defense the Ravens faced a couple weeks ago. The additions of Morgan Burnett and Joe Hayden's health have been huge for this defense. And of course, we just talked about it a little bit earlier, the injuries, that the 2 tackles will be out. It's going to be tough for this offense. I'm not expecting a monster game. I'm not expecting a big game for the Ravens offense at all, especially because how Pittsburgh can stop the run. My tier 3 matchups are Seattle Seahawks, Pittsburgh Steelers, New England Patriots, New Orleans Saints, Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, these tier 3 matchups are, I still love these matchups. They're all still plus draws. They're not as elite as tier 1 or tier 2. But these are still good. So on the Seattle side, the one guy I like to highlight is David Moore. And it feels a little point chasey, but hear me out on this one. Casey Hayward will most likely shadow Tyler Lockett on the outside, and Casey Hayward's been playing great all year. That leaves David Moore on the outside versus Trevor Williams, who allows 132 NFL rating this season, which is 8th worst in the NFL. So he has a plus draw, David Moore versus Trevor Williams. And also, Doug Baldwin does not have a good matchup against the slot corner for the Chargers either. So I'm actually looking to see David Moore. I'm putting him in my lineups this week. I think he's a solid wide receiver 3 flex. Pittsburgh versus Baltimore. You're going to start your studs. You're going to start Antonio Brown and Juju. But the one guy I do want to highlight is Vance McDonald. Very similar to New England, Baltimore is built on their trio of cornerbacks. And they're also inside the top 10, the bottom 10 in yards allowed per game, targets to the tight end per game, and also DVOA adjusted defense. So they're one of the 10 worst in each of those metrics. So I think Vance McDonald's a solid play this week against Baltimore. The Saints versus the Rams, and obviously you're starting your studs, but one thing I will say is this. When the Saints play at home, that's when the opportunity opens up for the complementary pieces. When the Saints are on the road, you want to avoid Cameron Meredith and Traquan Smith and Ben Watson, and you're just going to stick to your studs. This week, I think you can go after Traquan Smith. This is going to be a big Traquan Smith week. He gets a plus draw with outside corners Troy Hill and Marcus Peters. For the Rams are stronger up the middle for the slot receivers. I think that Traquan Smith on the outside can win that matchup, and I think that when the Saints are at home, you can play the complementary pieces versus when they're on the road. And then the last one is Tampa Bay. And Tampa Bay, for me, I love Ryan Fitzpatrick. He's been balling out this year. He has the highest NFL rating and Pro Football Focus quarterback ranking of any quarterback this season. He is playing out, lights out. And I think you fire up everybody in this matchup. Carolina versus Tampa Bay is probably one of my favorite matchups of the week to attack. Get Ryan Fitzpatrick in your lineup, Deshaun Jackson, Chris Godwin. You want them all in your lineup this week. Mike Evans, of course, is one of the best starts of the week against James Bradbury. So that wraps up the passing game. Let's move on to the running game. So what I do for the running game matchup is I use offensive line metrics from DVOA, offensive line versus defensive line. And I could basically compare them side by side and say who has the best running games and who has the worst run defenses. And I put them together and I find out what the best matchups are. So that being said, here's my lineup. Sony Michel this week is my number 1 run game matchup versus the Green Bay Packers. He needs to be in your lineups. He looks like he's going to be good to go. Dr. David Chow also said that a couple weeks ago that Sony Michel's injury was not severe and he should be back in a week or 2. So that looks like he's back on this timeline. Next up is Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb is at home against the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs' run defense is atrocious. Now, I've always talked about how the Kansas City's pass defense is very underrated. The opposite is for the Kansas City run game. So you want to play Nick Chubb this week. Get him in your lineups. He's going to be a solid play at home versus Kansas City. Next one is Mark Ingram. Obviously, you're starting Alvin Kamara, but another guy here is Mark Ingram. They have a plus draw versus the Rams' run defense. They have a great offensive line. They can run the football, and Mark Ingram looks good. He actually has a top 10 run grade according to Pro Football Focus since he's returned to action. He's actually a better runner than Alvin Kamara is, and I think that Mark Ingram has a big week this week against the Rams. Next up is Adrian Peterson. Don't have to say much, man. The guy's balling out. He looks good on film. He looks good in the metrics. And now this week he gets Atlanta Falcons. Enough said. Atlanta Falcons have getting abused in every facet of the game versus running backs. So you play Adrian Peterson. Next up is Phillip Lindsay. Royce Freeman looks on the closer side of doubtful. He is listed as questionable. He didn't really practice this week. I think you keep rolling with Phillip Lindsay, and we just talked about, too, Zach Cunningham, the linebacker for the Houston Texans, looks to be out, and the Denver run game has been fantastic all season. You start Phillip Lindsay. Finally, the last one is Aaron Jones, the new hotness. And if you hear this podcast and you have an opportunity to go trade for him, you go get him. Go get Aaron Jones. The loss of Ty Montgomery is big. It gives more opportunity for Aaron Jones to be on the football field and Jamal Williams, but Aaron Jones is now the guy. He outsnapped both Ty Montgomery and Williams last week combined, and he outsnapped them like 3-1 also. So this is big for him. I think this is going to be one of his coming out parties, and he gets a plus draw against New England this week. So that wraps up the skill position players on offense. Just want to run some through. So what I do is I have a kicking analysis every week. I basically take offensive drive statistics from Football Outsiders, and I basically figure out where you can find good matchups for kickers. So my kicker start of the week is going to be Kyan Fairbairn, the Houston Texans. If you can go get him, pick him up. He's owned in a lot of leagues, but if he's out there, pick him up. And my sleeper kicker is Brett Maher, who of the Cowboys is also. Because, whether you like it or not, kickers matter, man. I got 21 points from Brett Maher a couple weeks ago when I told everyone to start him. This is big, so try to pick up those guys if you can, put them in your lineup. Finally, the defenses. So I have 3 defenses I identified this week. The big one was obviously the Dallas Cowboys. Is my top streamer. Everyone he picked him up. I didn't even get the Cowboys in any of my leagues, so I had to move to my alternative ones, which was the Miami Dolphins and the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, the Chiefs are going to struggle to stop the run against Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb has the highest run grade, so they're my number 2. My number 1 is the Miami Dolphins, and the reason why I say this is Miami Dolphins, they've been getting gashed in the run, and I get that, but Miami Dolphins play better at home than they do on the road. They're at home against a Jets team that's banged up. Isaiah Crowell's banged up, Robbie Anderson, Quincy Enunwa. These guys are all banged up. Nate Sterling is out too as well. And, I just feel that based on all the metrics I've seen, they're one of the only few teams that actually has a plus matchup on defense versus the pass and the run. So that's why I picked the Miami Dolphins this week as my streamer. But that pretty much wraps up the podcast today, guys. I tried to make it a little bit quicker for you so you can get in and out. Once again, please go follow me on Instagram and also go follow me on Twitter. I post a bunch of these tidbits during the week on Twitter that don't make it to Instagram. So follow me on both, and also follow me here at Fantasy Football X Factor on YouTube to get all of it. So I hope you guys enjoyed the podcast today. Good luck in week 9, and I will talk to you next week.